Thank you, Charles. I'm Scott Malcolmson, Director of Special Projects at Strategic Insight Group, which mainly means that I manage the larger international investigations. Our main clients are institutional investors and other kinds of investors, although we have lots of different clients for both political risk and enhanced due diligence services based out of Fort Worth. The guests you will maybe remember from the invitation. Chris Sabatini is Senior Fellow for Latin America at Chatham House and was the founder of both America's Quarterly, founder of America's Quarterly, Executive Director of Global Americans. Juan Cruz Díaz is Managing Director at Cefedes Group in Buenos Aires and co-director of the Corporate Governance Program at the Universidad de San Andrés. And we're mainly talking about Mexico today, but talking about Mexico, we'll have to talk about the region. And I mean, I'm just going to basically hand over to Chris. Chris and Juan Cruz and I discussed what we were going to discuss a number of weeks ago, and it went on for about an hour and showed no signs of stopping. So I think we should just get right into the discussion. And that was even before the Colombian election and before the Summit of the Americas. So Chris, I'm just going to hand over to you. When last the three of us spoke, you were in Mexico City for Chatham House for a multi-day conference. So you have fresh news from the region, and I'm sure our audience will benefit greatly from your impressions and insights.
Thank you, Scott. First of all, thanks, Charles. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, D. Smith, who's tuned in, I know, dear friend. And Juan Cruz. Met Juan Cruz, I think it was 15 years ago. I was just counting. And what's amazing is Juan Cruz hasn't aged at all since then. I don't know what he has in his upstairs attic in terms of paintings, but it's probably aging. I'm going to talk about Mexico first, since I just was there, Scott mentioned. Then use it a little bit to pull back on political trends within the region and the implications of that for economic policy. But spoiler alert, my basic thesis is this: is that what we're not seeing Latin America as a shift to the left. Instead, what we're seeing is an anti-incumbent wave that just happens to be occurring when mostly conservative governments happen to be in power. Colombia, the pawn before, in Mexico. And in some cases, this is leading to sort of outsider populist politics, as happened under Mexico with AMLO now, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, under Brazil, under Bolsonaro, El Salvador, under Nayib Bukele, potentially under Costa Rica, under Rodrigo Chavez. Those are populists of different stripes, left and the right, but have very similar tendencies in terms of their consolidation of power, their disregard for checks and balances, their belief that they connect to people and the popular will, and this sort of appropriation of this saint-like vision of themselves or image to be the corrector of all things that are corrupt, which is everything except for them and their immediate party. But in most cases in Latin America that I'll talk about, Colombia is one, Chile is another, Peru certainly is another case. What we're seeing not so much as a rival of populist demagogues, but the fragmentation of party systems that has led to polarization, that has led to greater electoral volatility, and is leading to a certain amount of policy inconsistency. But I'll talk about all that in a second. Let me just talk a little bit about Mexico, because I was in Mexico, Scott mentioned. In fact, I was there with D. Smith, who was on a panel for the Chatham House conference we were doing on Latin America. And I had a chance to talk to businesses, government officials, observers, and of course sit in on the conference. And what we're seeing in Mexico in terms of economic trends and political trends is different. Mexico is always different, and it's having an implication overall for the region. The first of all, of course, was in 2018, a man who purported to be an outsider, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, better known as AMLO, was finally elected. He claimed actually had been elected originally in 2006. But this time he was legitimately elected. He had actually been a Perista before from the PRI that had governed the country for 70 years and started another party. It was the PRD, and then started another party, the Morena. It's often said that he's a leftist populist. And the truth is he's a very much of a 1970s leftist, if anything. I mean, he's a leftist in the sense that, if in the 1970s, if leisure suits were still popular, we're still listening to Donna Summer and disco. His vision of the left is very antiquated. He's not very progressive on issues of women's rights. He's denounced women's activists. He's denounced the attempts to define femicide or work and address issues of femicide. He's not terribly engaged on human rights. He also has a deep distrust of business, which I'll return to in a second. And he's also just not that engaged on the environment. He's building a refinery in his home state of Puebla, which will refine oil. He's really embraced a much more hydrocarbon-centric economy approach to energy, which both in electricity generation and sort of favoring of Pemex, the semi-state oil company that is under his purview. And of course, he's also gone ahead with infrastructure projects that sort of are threatening the environment. The Maya train is the most tourism train. It's going to go to the Yucatan and Quintana Roo states are the sort of best examples. So he's not really leftist the way we think about it, but he is very much a populist. He has his daily mañaneras, press conferences in which he denounces enemies of the state and personal enemies, oftentimes journalists. He denounces businesses. He complained when Citibank announced that it was going to sell its retail business. He said publicly that he thought that it should go to a Mexican banking interest, and Spanish banks, in particular, referring to Banco Santander, shouldn't be involved, or BBVA also, that there's already too much Spanish investment in his country. So he's very much that nationalist and that sort of populist bent. And this has an implication for the country's economic policy, except with one exception. One thing he hasn't been is particularly profligate. He is very frugal. It's attributed to the fact that his mother ran a store, and he sort of very much has a mindset of a small businessman. So as a result, during the COVID pandemic and the lockdown, the stimulus package he implemented was quite stingy. And as a result, debt to GDP ratios right now in Mexico are only about 52% rather. So 52% debt to GDP in Mexico, compared, for example, in Brazil, where it's about 97%, or Argentina, where it's over 100%. Mexico is in very good standing. Now, it's going to be affected dramatically by inflation. Mexico imports a lot of its foodstuffs. That's going to be obviously a hard hit. It will benefit somewhat from the energy, but a lot of the energy fields or oil fields that it was seeking before international investment in are drying up. And he's not investing properly in Pemex, rather, the state oil company. So probably not well positioned over the long term to take advantage of higher oil prices. And as a result, also energy prices are increasing. And so inflation is being very tightly felt in Mexico, particularly among the poor. And as Mexicans will tell you, and including the vice governor of the central bank told us, that basically their ability to control this inflation, first of all, because it's driven by external prices, but second of all, they're under effectively the purview of the U.S. Federal Reserve. So they're really on a difficult point of this. But despite this, and this goes to the point about populist and outsider candidates in Mexico, he remains very popular. AMLO is about 60% approval rating, even though he no longer enjoys 2/3 majority constitution, which absolute majority in the Congress. He does have a majority in Congress. It also looks like he will probably handpick his successor. It's between a number of people within his party. It's probably between Claudia Sheinbaum, the mayor of Mexico City, the foreign minister, Marcelo Ebrard, the former mayor of Mexico City, and the president of the Senate, Ricardo Monreal. But he claims it's going to be an open nomination process, but it probably will be more, as the PRI used to do it, por dedazo, by sort of finger pointing. The problem with all of this is that his distrust of the private sector hasn't really hurt him dramatically, but it has meant that he's missed many opportunities. The world is talking about nearshoring, it's talking about friendshoring, what have you. But the problem is I've spoken to a number of businesses who simply feel that AMLO is not taking advantage of this. He does not travel much. He's only been, I think, to Washington and to Cuba on his recent trips. He'll be going back to Washington in July. But he keeps sort of that regimen for his team as well. So they haven't been making tours, for example, to China or to South Korea. I heard from a South Korean company that wants to locate more of its manufacturing in the north of the country, but the government simply is not listening. I spoke to banks who also feel they would like to do more to attract investment, and they're knocking on the doors and no one's really answering. By the same token, on nearshoring, the government is not offering many tax incentives or land concessions that are typically necessary to attract that sort of investment, because it is obviously costly. So what you're seeing is a declining growth. Obviously, the Mexican economy, where more than 80% of its exports go to the United States, is going to be deeply tied to what happens in the U.S. in terms of its own economy. But by the same token, it's not sort of seizing the advantages of that. I would see sort of lower economic growth and not booming economic growth, but by the same token, not dramatic upheaval in terms of politics. Now, I'll talk, if I can, for a little bit about what's happening in the rest of the region, and because it's telling, again, I think, both in contrast to Mexico, but in terms of what to expect in terms of business environments. Just dial back a little bit. Before the COVID pandemic in 2019, we saw a wave of protests across the region. We saw in the pre-COVID era, we saw protests in Chile and Colombia, Ecuador, Dominican Republic. For different reasons, we saw them also in Bolivia and Venezuela. But basically, COVID sort of held those down for a while in 2019, and then we saw a sort of wave of elections that followed in 2020 and 2021. I remember that 2021 and 2022. But by the same token, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has severely affected Latin America. For one reason, rising fuel prices, even for most energy producers, are having a huge effect on energy prices and not necessarily generating revenue. Because of lower energy prices, Brazil, for example, didn't invest in the exploration or extraction of oil in the pre-salt areas. Venezuela's oil production has sunk from 2 million barrels per day to 700 to 800,000 barrels per day. And as I mentioned, Mexico's actually, its production has also declined. But also, if you include in that other countries that are more energy dependent, like Chile, like the Caribbean countries or Central America, they're really going to feel the bite of, or are feeling already the bite of, rising fuel prices. By the same token, rising food prices could be good for the southern cone countries that produce wheat and beef and chicken and soy, and indeed, but they are going to benefit from higher food prices. By the same token, though, again, Caribbean countries, Central American countries, and Mexico will be deeply affected by the rise, and already are by the rise in food prices. And so, it used to be said that when the U.S. sneezed, Latin America caught a cold. Now it seems actually when the global markets sneeze, Latin America is going to catch pneumonia. And part of that is the benefit of having a Latin America that's much more integrated into global supply chains. Again, Chile has free trade agreements with more than 20 countries. Colombia, almost the same. There's the Pacific Alliance of Chile, Peru, Mexico and Colombia. Of course, they're also trying to tie themselves together with the CPTPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the updated Trans-Pacific Partnership minus the U.S. And of course, China is the number one export market for Brazil, Argentina, Chile, and Peru. So all of these global trends are going to affect the economies. Now, what that means, however, is we've seen sort of uneven economic growth. In 2019, economic growth, because of a global cool down, was already quite low, even before the pandemic. On average in Latin America, it was 0.2%. So growth had flatlined from the era of the 2000s, early 2000s, when with the commodities boom. Latin America disproportionately contracted economically in 2020, contracting by negative 7.4%. It started to grow again in 2021 by an average of 4%. But again, that means it's still 3 percentage points down. And in 2022, this year, it was originally expected to grow by about 2.9%. I think that's going to be downgraded. So basically, after flatlining just before the pandemic and then a massive contraction of 7.4%, this year, it probably still will not have grown to recover to where it was in 2019. As I mentioned, the debt to GDP ratio in Mexico is doing quite well. Other countries are doing a little bit better, let's say, than Argentina and Brazil. Colombia's debt to GDP ratio is 61.4%. Ecuador's is 65.3%. But all of this should be, well, on the one hand, most of these countries are in better positions in terms of their debt structure. Most of that debt is in local currency and not instead of the U.S. So they're in better sense there if their currency declines. But the problem there is, of course, with the Federal Reserve raising interest rates, is going to find less space on capital markets to be able to continue to roll over debt. Most of the liquidity will head towards safer markets, the U.S. and the global north, which will mean that they'll have fewer funds to be able to roll over that debt and expand social safety nets. It's unclear to what extent COVID will affect long-term poverty rates, but we already know that probably the middle class, as a result of COVID and the economic contraction, will shrink from about 2019 until today, has shrunk by about 3%. And this is unprecedented. You had a huge boom in the early 2000s in which more than 50 million people joined the middle class, a loosely defined fragile middle class, granted of about $10 to $13 per day. But now we actually see people slipping back into poverty. And this increase in poverty rate is going to have a very severe effect on politics, which brings me to the point on the political trends we're seeing. What we've seen overall, and here I'll key into the Colombia elections that just occurred on Sunday, the second round, is basically party systems, and the Colombia is emblematic because it's a party system that really is centuries old between the liberals and conservatives, have effectively evaporated. Argentina is the exception to this, but in Colombia, in Chile, Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, obviously even Brazil, party systems have effectively evaporated. Centers have fallen out. What we have are the rise of outsider candidates. Now, in some cases, those outsider candidates are very strong-minded populists. Here comes my cat. You're going to see my cat. But in other cases, what you're seeing is a high degree of electoral volatility. Gabriel Boric, the sort of the star of the international scene right now in Chile, was elected this year, and already his approval ratings are down to about 30%. We can test why that is, but structurally, what's most important, whether we like him or not, or we have hopes for him, in his success, the truth is there's structural reasons for this, in that basically he had a very heterogeneous coalition and was elected in a very polarized election. The same is going to be true in Colombia with Gustavo Petro. The second round of the elections pitted two outsider candidates, a man, Gustavo Petro, who had been mayor of Bogota, but of the left, who now Colombia has elected its first president of the left, but then on the far right, or somewhere, we don't really know left or right, Rodolfo Fernandez, a former mayor, who was really an unknown quantity, a little bit of a loose cannon. He used to give television interviews in his pajamas. I'm not talking about like during COVID when we wore pajama bottoms. We may even be doing that now, but I mean like head to toe pajamas, and he gave interviews. It was a completely different party system. And by the same token, though, Petro also heads a very heterogeneous coalition of unions, rural groups, indigenous organizations, and the like. And he does not enjoy a mandate in Congress. He has a minority in both houses of the Colombian Congress, which means his very ambitious plans for free university education, increasing taxes on business, taxing unproductive land, redistributing land, even negotiating peace with the other guerrilla group, the ELN, is going to really face an uphill battle in Congress, but also popularly. And by the same token, we're seeing this in Peru. The utter decimation of a party system has led to a Congress and a president that are constantly at odds. President Castillo is a former public school teacher, had never held elected office before. Again, I think there were like 25 different candidates in the first round of the elections. He only received less than 20% in the first round of the elections, but because of the fragmented party system, when he went to the second round, he was just barely able to get barely enough to be elected in the second round. He's now gone through 50 ministerial changes and 4 complete cabinet changes. And I think there've been 2 attempts to impeach him, and now there's an indictment against him. This is about and he only there are 10 different parties in the single chamber Peruvian Congress. And he has a very slim minority. within that. So what we're going to be looking at, and with this I'll wrap up, and I'm interested in hearing Juan Cruz's remarks, because Argentina is different. What we're looking at, again, is high levels of voter distrust of the system, high levels of political polarization, no real pillars of or even central cleavages to drive a party system programmatic debate and policy. And with that comes a high level of simple, throw the bums out, which is what we're seeing, whether left or right, just throw the bums out. Obviously, this is being painted as a pink wave or another wave. Again, I see this as more of an anti-incumbency wave, and we're already seeing this. And if I can make a prediction, I predict Petro's popularity will probably slump down to about 20% a year from now, much as Boric's. So what we're looking at is some pretty rough sailing for a number of these governments. The question will be to what extent, these governments are willing to engage in the sorts of compromise, and they have the patience to engage in the compromise with Congresses and with constituencies that is necessary to govern, or to what extent they engage in more sort of roughshod, autocratic policymaking. What it does mean, certainly, is that we're looking at a greater, I think, policy volatility. We're looking in terms of economic policy, irrespective of the rationality of these programs and the sensibility and logic of them. There's going to be a certain inconsistency, and for whether in Chile or in Colombia or Mexico, the secret to their economic success up until now has primarily been policy consistency across administrations. I think that is about to end. The second thing is a great change in foreign policy. Now, it is true that there will be mostly leftist governments in Latin America and South America, particularly, likely, especially if Lula wins in Brazil this year. I think you're going to see a much more contentious, assertive, even anti-American foreign policy in which the Latin America tries to separate itself much more from U.S. Control and even markets with uncertain consequences. And I think the Summit of the Americas, which happened a few weeks ago, was a perfect example of that, where some countries decided not to come, and the U.S. had to in some cases, actually in the case of Bolsonaro in Brazil, had to promise him a bilateral meeting just to get him to show up. So I'll end there. I'm interested in hearing what questions are, and also how my dear friend Juan Cruz responds. So
thank you, Chris. That was breakneck and amazing, as always.
It's the coffee.
Yeah, I want to interject just before Juan Cruz comes on. Well, first of all, just so everybody in the audience knows, if you do have questions, please type them in as comments, and we'll sort of collate them and take them on in a little while. I just had three questions for you, Chris. One, these are all sort of paradoxes, I guess. But so in terms of Mexico, it's striking that you have this populist force behind AMLO, but at the same time, his own sort of party is relatively stable and actually politically likely to remain politically dominant. So on the one hand, you identify the sort of anti-establishment, anti-systemic populist urge. On the other hand, that argument then makes the relative stability of the rest of the system kind of odd, and also the lack of opposition, since populism rarely takes over for long. So if you could maybe talk a bit both about why there is that stability of his party, despite its basically sort of anti-systemic energy, and then why the lack of any strong opposition within Mexico. And then second question, you talked about nearshoring and friendshoring. So theoretically, if you're in Southeast Asia, U.S.-China conflict is not necessarily a bad thing, because production relocates, supply chains are extended in different ways in order to get out of the kind of U.S.-China showdown. Theoretically, that could happen in Mexico in particular, with its access to the U.S. market. This is an argument Shannon O'Neill has made repeatedly over the last 6 months or so. So I'm just curious, is there a massive missed opportunity in the region for essentially taking advantage of the regionalization of markets, and in particular the North American desire for a certain amount of relative isolation. And then thirdly, and also relatedly, you talked about both oil prices and food prices, oil production rather, and food prices going up, partly as a result of the war in Ukraine. Again, I mean, in principle, high oil prices are not a bad thing for a region that makes a lot of its money by getting oil and selling it. It could theoretically lead to more investment in Mexico and even in Venezuela. And at the same time, agricultural production has long been the thing that many analysts point to as a Latin American strength, particularly in a period of climate change elsewhere. So are those again sort of missed opportunities as well as problems in the region? And I'm sorry, Juan Cruz, but I had to get those in, and then we'll get to you in a second. But if you can just kind of tap at those questions a little, Chris, that'd be great.
Sure. So first of all, on the Mexico front, the enduring popularity of AMLO and the lack of an opposition. What does happen, as I mentioned, across the board, although the outcomes so far have differed, is the collapse of party systems. AMLO's party sort of pretty much, it's not a one-man show, but he certainly pulls the strings on the other people within the party. And the traditional party system has collapsed. The traditional one-time parties that dominated, especially the PRI, the PAN, and the PRD, which was an offshoot of the PRI, really now they're forming coalitions among themselves, which is a very populist, I think, makes for odd bedfellows. In this case, they're trying to run unitary candidates against Morena, against AMLO. So, and this is always a challenge in these collapsing party systems, is the traditional parties try to form these coalitions, and it's sort of, in some ways, it's more damning because it looks like they just want to return to the ancien regime, the status quo ante, when in fact politics have moved on. Just one quick story: when I was in Venezuela, where its party system, of course, collapsed in 1998 with the arrival of Chavez. I remember meeting with the AD, the Acción Democrática Party, and this is no joke. They were talking about how they're going to form an alliance with the COPEI, which was the conservative party. Acción Democrática was a social democrat. And they said they had just elected a new head of youth outreach. And they introduced me to the guy, and he had to be about 70 years old. It's like, really, here's your new youth guy. This is the best you can do. But there is this sort of element of they just simply cannot quite, the capacity of political elites, I think anywhere, to delude themselves into believing their continued relevance is something that continues to amaze me over and over again. And in Mexico, what's happened is, and this is what's also odd, and it defies traditional political science, sort of, especially rational choice theories. Despite the fact that violence has peaked, despite the fact that economic recovery has flatlined in Mexico, AMLO remains very popular. And despite all the other things in the United States, whatever you may think of Donald Trump, it is astounding. I mean, he doesn't think he lost the elections in 2020, but he did. It is astounding that the elections were as close as they were. Truly. I mean, if you were just somebody give you all those numbers and then tell you, well, what do you think? Would he win or not? They would be, I think, most people who have a lifetime in elections and politics would have been surprised. That's sort of the issue, and I think this was always the same was true often for Peronistas in the past in Argentina as well. They always had an enduring popularity well beyond after the gas ran out of their economic model, whether it was statist or privatization under Carlos Menem. So a certain amount of you can ride the wave of voter distrust and anger for pretty long ways, especially when it's directed against an opposition that simply can't understand how to remake itself and is very fragmented. So in large part, the issue in AMLO right now and the enduring popularity of AMLO, and I don't know whether he'll be able to pass on his sort of common touch and his charisma, I doubt it, to a successor, but right now that just continues, and it defies political logic in many ways. That was also true of Hugo Chavez. I mean, even now, if you look in Venezuela, according to polls, we can't believe them, Nicolas Maduro, despite the fact the economy is contracted by two-thirds of the economy is just evaporated, he now has about 20% approval rating. That doesn't reflect so much on the acknowledgement of his policies. They just don't like the other guys, and they simply wanted to change, and they don't want to go back to the way it was pre-1999. So Yeah, it's a very complicated factor, but I think we're looking at a situation when common rational calculations of voters no longer apply in moments of intense anger and rejection of the ruling class, and the search for someone who can really capture that sentiment. And certainly, AMLO, who loves to talk about his moral approach, and he appropriates a sort of saintly image of himself of correcting people's problems against a corrupt class. He's captured that, and it defies logic, at least traditional political logic. On the issue of high energy,
systemic populism actually can be a stable form of government if you're in Latin America. So, just quickly on U.S.-China possible advantages and oil and food, and
so quickly on oil. I'll start with that because that was your other the problem is again, when Brazil first sought was licensing rights to tap the pre-salt, conditions weren't all that favorable, and then the price of oil went down. So they have to sort of relicense or rebid a lot of those fields and get people in. And of course, they're in very difficult, hard to reach places. So it's going to take a long time. There's going to be a long tail before they can take advantage of that. In Venezuela, we at Chatham House recently did a study. It was estimated that recovering Venezuela's oil production to its pre-2013 levels of 2 million barrels a day will take $78 billion worth of investment. Okay, it may take up to, and that's generous, and it'll take 8 years. So unfortunately, it would be nice if oil, you just like a tap, you just turn it on, adjust a little hot water here, a little hot water, but you can't. And so I don't know where the Vaca Muerta fields are in Argentina. I'll be interested in hearing Juan Cruz's reaction of that. But with oil prices so low, a lot of these programs were mothballed, and now it's going to take a while to dust them out of the closet. On the issue of nearshoring, I'm going to quote Ricardo Hausman, a professor at Harvard, and the truth is, he says, "Look, nearshoring is not a development strategy. It's not. I mean, we just all sort of assume this is just going to happen, and it doesn't. It takes incentives. It takes infrastructure. It takes labor rights. It takes trade agreements. I mean, the truth is Mexico does have the trade agreements in place. It takes tax concessions. It takes land concessions. It takes security. A number of the businesses we were talking about are saying, in fact, I was just talking to, I won't name it, a company this week that was visiting in London, and saying that a lot of their stuff is being hijacked on the highways. They're writing off a lot of their goods. So it's nice to say it, but the truth is you have to recognize you have to create an ecosphere for nearshoring. It just doesn't happen like migration, like sort of monarch butterflies going to Michoacan, which are beautiful, by the way. If you get a chance to go, it's very nice to see. But you can't just make it happen, will it to happen. There.
Okay, Juan Cruz, hard act to follow, but you can do it.
Yeah, it's a difficult task, Scott. Thank you very much, Scott, Charles, Dee, and of course, Chris. It's actually 16 years, not 15. But yeah, it's been a long time. It's nice to be here with all of you. I have to say that I mostly agree with Chris. I'm quite aligned on what he thinks. I think this is what we're seeing in Latin America. It's not Latin America going to the left. It's not the first time that we discuss this. I actually have this here. This is actually the first thing that I did with Chris like 15 years ago. Under his vision and leadership, he founded America's Quarterly, and this is the first edition.
That's not you on the cover, on Cruz. It doesn't. No, that's not you.
That's actually, we back then, 15 years ago, we were all discussing this pink tide in Latin America and Latin America going to the left. It's not the first time that we discussed it. Of course, there were different times, different periods, different circumstances, different leadership. But I think we keep discussing this every time that we see a shift to the left. But we need to look further, and it's a different thing. And I have to say something I think it's very important. Latin America is not one thing. It would be a mistake for observers and investors to see Latin America as one thing. Of course, there are a lot of commonalities between countries, but each country is quite different. The political and the economic and the social situation is very different. And I wouldn't make the mistake of analyzing Latin America as a whole without looking at every single particular case. And I think that's very important. But one thing that it's a commonality and it's key for what is happening is inequality, and I think was behind what Chris has been talking about this. Behind the collapse of the party system, behind the wave of protests that we saw in Chile and Colombia and elsewhere, behind the rise of these, anti-elite or anti-establishment candidates, both from the left or from the right, we found a deep-rooted inequality. Latin America is the most unequal region in the world. So we can see a lot of billionaires and unicorn companies and successes and potential, oil fields and agriculture, but poverty is a big problem, and the broken promises of this the democratic way that we've been living, luckily, in the last 30 years in the region, democracy has not fulfilled the promise of equality that for many people many people expected, and so the political system are quite under stress because of this. So I think this is very important to see. Latin America is very different. Each country has different processes, but inequality is a commonality that is putting a lot of stress across the region, and that's why we're seeing all these anti-elite candidates. I wouldn't say anti-systemic. We have Gabriel Boric in Chile. Of course, he's a new leader, he's a student leader, but actually they form a political party. They're playing within the system. The same as Macri in Argentina. Macri is a businessman, billionaire. He used to run the second most important football team in Argentina and then jump into politics. But actually, he uses like a party system, a party structure. He played within the rules of the game. And I would say the same with Petro. Petro, everybody's putting like a former guerrilla, but he's actually, he was elected a congressman in '91. He's been a major. He's an insider. So the same with AMLO. All these politicians that are running an anti-elite, I would say, agenda are still insiders in the political system. So I would say that. Of course, AMLO is extremely popular. Behind all this, it's extremely resilient. He's over 50% on his approval ratings. He's way more popular than Morena, his party, and that's why he will be key. As you said, Chris, we will probably see a Lasso back in Mexico. Claudia or Marcelo Ebrard or whomever he picks, he will be decisive as he was in the referendum, as he was in the gubernatorial elections, which was interesting to see that Morena made inroads in states that were not traditionally the stronghold of the south of Morena. We made inroads in new states in Mexico. So we're seeing a very strong president with a lot of approval ratings, and of course you have this you can do that parallelism that you made, Chris, about how come despite the problems that is the model of AMLO Morena, the same that Peronism in Argentina, but I think we need to look, despite the rational choice models, of how these leaders are connecting and talking to people. A lot of people in Argentina, in Chile, in Brazil, in Colombia and Mexico and so on, are connecting with leaders that are talking to them in a different way that the traditional elites have done. So I think that's still that emotional link is quite important when we look at AMLO or when we look at Peronism and others across the region. So I think that's very important. And despite this anti-business sentiment that AMLO expresses, and despite the tensions that you might see with the US, of course, another paradox was that the AMLO's relation with Trump was much more, was better than the one that he has with Biden, because in a way, this disengagement in a way that Trump showed to the region, or maybe governing styles that were in a way a connection, created a link that actually doesn't have with Biden. This principled U.S. foreign policy that that Biden is trying to show, and this selective engagement that the U.S. does with the region is creating a lot of distrust from not only AMLO but most of Latin American leaders, that they don't feel comfortable with this selective engagement strategy that the U.S. is giving. And as Chris says, and we discussed it with Scott before, the Summit of the Americas invitations drama that we saw in the past a few weeks ahead before the summit was a show of that. But it's not that. I mean, I read a lot of interpretations that, you know, AMLO, Boric, or Fernandez were supporting dictators. That's not. I mean, that's not a right reading of the situation. I mean, when President Fernandez made his speech at the Summit of the Americas, claiming that everyone should be invited, he was talking as president of the CELAC. The CELAC is the community of Latin American and Caribbean countries, which if Lula gets elected next year, at least we will have a year in which the CELAC, which will be a key platform in which we will see some coordination between some Latin American leaders which exist. You know, I have the chance to speak with some of the leaders and meet with some people around some of these presidents, and there's conversations before, there were conversations, active conversations before the summit between AMLO, Alberto Fernandez, and Gabriel Boric about presenting this common narrative about that everybody should be invited, everybody should be seated in the negotiation, and the best way to make improvements in the Venezuela situation, or especially in the Venezuela situation, is having them seated at the table. There's a lot of distrust about OAS approach and the US approach on what happened in Bolivia, for example, which the US and or the OAS quickly recognized the government of Añez as a legitimate government, which most of the Latin American, center to the left governments did not recognize as a legitimate government. There's a lot of distrust at the OAS and the US of the role that they're giving to Juan Guaidó in Venezuela and the access to resources that they're giving to Juan Guaidó, which most of Latin American countries do not recognize him as a legitimate leader in a way. So these Latin American leaders are not trusting the US or the OAS having these approaches. So that's the way we need to see the situation. I think we will see a lot of coordination vis-a-vis the relation with the US in the next few months. Of course, not only Bolsonaro had the possibility to have a bilateral meeting with Biden ahead of the summit. Alberto Fernandez is going to be there in 3 weeks in Washington, and he will have a bilateral meeting with President Biden at the White House, something that Cristina never got. I mean, Cristina was always had always the intention to be invited to the White House, and Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner was never invited to that meeting, and Alberto Fernandez is getting that. So despite all the unpopular or the low approval ratings that Alberto Fernandez had down here, I mean, he has access to Latin American leaders, to global leaders. A few weeks ago, he was in Europe meeting with all the leaders. He will have the bilateral with Biden. So there's a lot of things happening around there, but long story short, I think we will see a lot of coordination with AMLO, Petro, Boric, potentially Lula, and Alberto Fernandez vis-a-vis the relation with the US. And there's another thing. There's a lot of pressure that we're seeing from the US vis-a-vis the relationship with China. We see this, most notably with the 5G saga and others. But for most of Latin American countries, and Chris told something about this before, it's an impossible situation. I mean, most of Latin American countries have as a main trading partner China. The main exports go to China, but also the US is probably the most important foreign direct investors in these countries. And what all these countries need is dollars through the exports and through the investments. So it's impossible for most of the countries in the region to pick a side. It's an impossible game because the U.S. and I think the Summit of the Americas showed that it's not willing or not ready or not prepared or it's not in a position to engage financially in the region in a way to compensate what China brings to the region. I mean, the U.S. basically brought nothing to the summit in LA. They had this discussion on migration, which is important for probably Mexico and the Northern Triangle, whatever, but not for the rest of the region. So for Latin America, it's an impossible situation to pick sides there. They need both China and they need both the U.S. So you will see in this coordinated approach a lot of balancing with China in that sense. And despite this, AMLO's probably distrust with the Biden administration, the relation between Mexico and the U.S. is very institutionalized. Of course, through USMCA, the artist formerly known as NAFTA, the bilateral, the high-level bilateral economic dialogue which is being restarted. And the institutional relation between the U.S. and Mexico, I think, is still very strong. And in a way, I think it's a key element to, in a way, condition or to, in a way, secure the business interests that the U.S. and North America has in Mexico. Of course, it's worrisome for the business climate on many things that AMLO has been approaching in a way, but I think there are a lot of institutional constraints. Mexico has a lot of free trade agreements in place as well, so there are a lot of institutional constraints on that sense. And despite having majority in Congress, he doesn't have enough majority to make more profound changes. So I still think that we are talking with him, of course, probably a more, some would call populist. I'm sometimes hesitant to use that concept, but I would say still within democratic frameworks. And I think this trend that this trend that we're seeing to the left in the region, I think it's quite democratic still. We're not seeing in Chile or still in Colombia and Mexico or even in Argentina a situation like that. In Argentina, for example, I mean, the Supreme Court is clearly at odds with the president. The president does not control the Congress. Certainly, the press, it's mostly critical to the government, and the chances that the opposition will win next year are very high. So let me
interrupt you there, Juan Cruz. I'm sorry, but I really want to get a little bit more of Chris because he's got to dash out the door, and I'm not going to ask my question about Julian Assange and AMLO. Rather, I'm hoping, Chris, you might have a few reactions to what Juan Cruz was saying before you have to take off.
Yeah, and there's also a question in this. So
there are two questions there. There is, and you can address those if you like, or Juan Cruz can take a crack at those after you have to go.
Okay, I'll take a crack at them too. So first of all, I agree with most of what Juan Cruz said. And if I gave the impression that Gustavo Petro and Boric were anti-systemic, that's not what I intended to say. I think they're actually. I mean, this is part of it. The most troubling thing is this sort of polarization that presents them as such. I mean, you open up conservative newspapers online, of course, because no one does it in person anymore, in Chile and Colombia, and it's scary what they're accusing these presidents or president-elects of being. It's ridiculous. So that's actually the real risk, is the polarization and the alarmism around it. But no, in fact, I mean, Boric is very much of the system. Petro is very much of the system. A congressman and mayor, maybe not have been a good mayor. We can discuss that, but he last I checked, the Bogota government's still up and running and still has a city council. So that's and the one thing, and this is what I appreciate Juan Cruz mentioning this, because it is the truth is that in many of these cases institutions are enduring. Say what we will about the peculiarities of AMLO in Mexico. Basically his energy reform bill, which he had staked a lot on, lost, and he retreated. Morena's taking over state governments, but the state governments are being they're being well run. And so the institutions are enduring, and he attacks the media, but the media is still open, free and fair. They may be a little bit cowed, but they're still free and fair. The judicial system, even the electoral institute, which he's been attacking, words and deeds. So far, it's been mostly words and a little bit of whittling away. And the same thing even in Brazil. Again, we all sort of gnash our teeth about what may happen with Bolsonaro. But the Supreme Court stands up to him. He's had to craft a coalition in Congress, a Central, to get things passed. And you've got a very diverse and very vibrant and robust federal system. I was just talking the other day to someone in the Ministry of Defense. They say, what happens if there's a coup in Brazil? I was like, hey, you've got governors who would resist. This is not, you need to understand the complexity of these systems and understand that these institutions, for all their weaknesses, are enduring, and they will continue. So that's the second thing. The third thing I would say is I would agree that the Summit of the Americas was problematic. I think the migration accords, it was also ironic that most of the countries that are sending countries, the Northern Triangle, weren't even there. So Mexico and the Northern Triangle weren't even there. So it's like, discussing migration, the summit, without them there is like going to marriage counseling without your spouse. I mean, I don't, why it was like, but what's the point? It's a sending problem. It's not even a receiving problem. And then the last thing I have to disagree with Juan Cruz on. He said that Mauricio Macri owned the second most important football team in Argentina. Okay. And if you know Argentina, and if you know Juan Cruz, he's saying that Boca Juniors is the second most important team over River Plate. And I think that's deeply contestable. So that one, I'm sorry, we're gonna have to part ways on that one, Cruz. I have the other questions too. I'm sorry. It's umbrage at his insult against the Boca Juniors.
There are two questions. If you have time, I should read them because the audience can't see them. So. Yeah. Rafael Vaquera asking, what do you think is the role of Pemex for the current administration in Mexico as they expand fossil fuel capacity in the midst of climate change and a global transition to low carbon sources of energy? And Sebastian Zutz asking, again, regarding Mexico, AMLO's term will end in 2024. Morena was basically a single cause movement founded to support AMLO's quest for the presidency. What will happen to Morena after AMLO leaves office? Will it become a real party? In what direction will it evolve?
So, again, I want to thank Juan Cruz for the corrective on this, because I don't want to overstate. But in the case of Pemex, for AMLO, this is his traditional. He's showing himself as a priista through and through on this. When it comes to Pemex, he likes Pemex for both the revenue and patronage it will provide. He likes it, which was sort of lost when basically Pemex was effectively opened up for investment of the oil fields, and he likes to have close relations with the oil workers unions, which were once very close to the PRI. So that's what's driving it, is the desire to have everyone. It's tempting for any populist to want to have a state oil company because it's great employment, it's great, and so that's really what's driving it. And I don't think that'll change. I mean, I don't think, similarly with Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, again, these are leftist governments, but in fact, Hugo Chavez, basically polluted, damaged the environment irreparably, and basically stripped the independence of PDVSA. I'm not saying that will happen with Pemex, but the temptation is just too large. And so I do think, AMLO loves to talk about a Sembrando Vida, which is the tree planting as his big environmental initiative, just planting trees. And they didn't even attend at the presidential level the COP26 meeting in Glasgow here in the UK. So I don't actually think, his interests are not in the environment. His interests are in politics and pure power and coalitions especially with unions. It's not a particularly green government. It isn't. And I'll just say this too, is give you an idea of how autocratic he is within his own cabinet. The economy minister came to our conference, Chatham House conference in Mexico, and spoke about Sembrando Vidas, the tree planting, as sort of the major environmental initiative of the government and diplomatic initiative for some odd reason. Sebastian, on the question of Morena, will survive? I don't think anyone knows. I do think, as Juan Cruz said, it's doing quite well in local elections. it is a one-man show in the sense that he founded it. He's going to direct who becomes the next president, but it's showing some legs. It's showing some legs in terms of diversity. Ricardo Monreal, who's the head of the Senate, who's from Zacatecas, who's governor of Zacatecas, really is in fact, he probably won't get the nod to be the presidential candidate because he's so outspoken. Meanwhile, Ebrard and Scheinbaum, the two other potential candidates, are being very close-lipped about sort of criticizing AMLO. But I think it may endure. I think he's assembled a coalition, but as elections go on and on, it's showing some legs. It can put up good candidates. I wouldn't write it out. And I think actually what it's doing is it's also sapping the PRD, which was traditionally the left. And so in the PRD now, in aligning itself with the PAN, again, makes it look like it's just way too much status quo ante. So with that.
Well, Chris, you probably need to go. So thank you.
Sorry.
No, it was brilliant. It's just really, really, really great to hear from you. So thank you. And Charles, did you want to throw in a question for Juan Cruz or?
Thank you. And go Boca Juniors.
Juan Cruz, if you can take a shot at the two questions about
Yes.
Morena as well. But Charles, did you have a question?
No, not particularly. I mean, I'll leave it to you.
Okay. Juan Cruz.
Yeah, I in the second question, I don't have the crystal ball, but I would anticipate that it will endure. I think as I said before, I don't think they are outsiders, and they are playing as insiders, and Morena has a party structure, has a party vibrance, and there are, as Chris mentioned, there are other leaders that you can identify. Marcelo Ebrard is quite active. The mayor of Mexico, Claudio Sheinbaum, is very active. The head of the Senate and others, they're making inroads in new states. So there are other leaderships going there. I can, as Argentine, I will do a parallelism maybe with Macri as well. He was supposedly an outsider, but we play the rules. He plays the rules with the insider rules. He created a new party, the PRO, which has a party structure, a party base, and other leaders and other potential leaders that could, become leaders as well. For example, the mayor of the city of Buenos Aires, Horacio Rodríguez Larreta, who's right now the front runner for the next year presidential elections. But I'm saying these are new leaders, new leaderships that are benefiting for the basically the erosion of the traditional party structures, but they're actually creating new parties and playing with party rules and party coalitions and so on. So I would anticipate that unless something happens, that we cannot anticipate right now, I would say that it will endure and it will be shaping the future of Mexican politics for a few years. And in the first question, I'm taking from what Chris just said, most of these Latin American, progressive leaders or parties of presidents are not necessarily quite aligned with the green agenda. Probably with the exception of Boric, who has been very vocal on the green agenda, but he will have a hard time, because mining, which is basically what drives Chile, is very intense in Chile. And with a lot of environmental problems, and I don't see any chance, that Boric can change that in a way. Even the fishing industry in Chile has been, of course, having a lot of environmental, issues. So it is certainly a green. He has a green agenda. But it will be very hard for him to deliver there. Probably the same with Petro in Colombia. Petro, has been having a green agenda narrative in his campaign, but it will be very hard for them to deliver in that front. I mean, and because most of these countries still depend a lot on the extractive industries and natural resources extractive industries, which are mostly at odds with the new standards of climate, or even agriculture. Argentina, for example, or Brazil, have very intensive agriculture that it's sometimes at odds with the environment. So I would say that.
Right. And in Peru as well, for that matter. I mean, Latin American agriculture can be extremely environmentally damaging. So it sounds like I would presume, and I wonder if you agree, that the yet another unanticipated result of Russia's aggression in Ukraine would be to probably weaken overall the green agenda in Latin America, because it will both increase the need for extractive resources and for food, agriculture, fish, everything. It's hard to see how it would do anything but make that situation worse.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to respond one comment of Chris, I mean, Vaca Muerta is actually in the shale deposit in Argentina. I mean, it's actually thriving. Argentina is at record levels of oil extraction and gas, and actually. Of all the disputes and polarization that we're seeing in Argentine politics, one thing that they are all agreeing is like the need of building the gas pipes and eventually an LNG facility to liquefy the gas and being able to export that gas to mostly Europe. That's something that they're all agreeing on. I mean, we're having a lot of debates and discussions on how to do that right now. But that seems to be the direction that is going, and we're seeing, with these prices in terms of commodities, soy and wheat and so on, we're seeing, a lot of activity in that sense. And again, that puts some pressure on the green agenda. I think that there's another question there.
Oh, has there been so there is. Okay. Two questions, actually. So Carlos Verdeja Prieto wrote, in my opinion, Latin America does not need a USA-China balance in the region. China indeed has acquired natural resources, including essential minerals, lithium. The historical lack of synergies creation among LATAM countries. Right. Okay. So something that could be very advisable to start together with the USA and Canada. I'm actually having a little trouble putting together what the question there is. Well, Charles's question is exceedingly clear. Any opinion on the referendum on Chile's constitution?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, the process it's been interesting, and the government is having a hard time right now. I mean, the referendum is going to be in a couple of months from now, and we're seeing we're seeing with more clarity what's the new draft of the constitution looks like, and of course there's a lot of criticism and there's a lot of movements right now in terms of criticizing the it was just a comment. Okay. There's a lot of movement in criticizing the draft of the constitution, and there is some questions if the referendum is going to approve the new constitution, and if that doesn't happen, that will really create a headache, for not only for the process but for the government, because that will leave a big problem unsolved. Let's just for context, for in the case that not everybody is up to date with what happened there, is Chile of course has a lot of policy consistency in the last 30 years that create a lot of benefits from the Chilean model, that took a lot of people out of poverty, strengthened the middle class, but especially in the last few years reflected a lot of inequalities, and I'm coming back to the inequality part. And there's big portions of the Chilean population that weren't able to access the benefits of the success of the Chilean history and the Chilean model, which was very concentrated in a few hands. We've been seeing in the last decade or so, or more than a decade, start on social protests. Actually, the most visible was over a decade ago, when current president and his allies came up to be quite notorious because they were student leaders, and we have a very intense student protest over a decade ago that promised some changes to the Chilean system that never happened. Former President Bachelet, in her second term, noticed this, and she tried to develop reforms to the Chilean system to be more connected to the popular demands in that sense. But actually, the economic and the political establishment was quite hard on President Bachelet, and she wasn't able to pursue these reforms. And everything exploded during the President Piñera's second experience as president, and exploded in a very dramatic way, where social conflicts and social protests were actually very virulent, I would say, very, I don't want to say violent, but they were very, very strong, and basically vanished the presidential term of President Piñera. And the way that the Chilean system had to react to this is to call to the constitutional reform. The current constitution, despite it has some changes, is the constitution that former dictator Augusto Pinochet left in place. So most of the left, or most of the progressive sectors in the Chilean system were demanding that democracy needs to produce a new constitution, a democratic constitution that reflects these popular demands that this Chilean model wasn't able to fulfill. So that is to praise the Chilean democracy, as Chris was saying before, how institutions are reacting. Instead of collapsing the whole political system in Chile, the reaction was to call a constitutional convention. This constitutional convention reflects not that much the last presidential elections, but it reflects what happened after the protest. So it has a lot of non-political and non-partisan representation, a lot of social movement, indigenous movement, and even women's movement representing the sectors in the Constitutional Convention that they don't have too many links to some of the more traditional political sectors. So the outcome of the Constitution, in a way, it sometimes could be a little long and with a lot of wishful thinking situation, which will have a tension in how to implement the promises of that constitution. That is being discussed right now strongly in Chile in order to approve or not this constitution. If it's not approved, which it could be a possibility, because even people who supported President Boric is now not supporting the constitution, that will create a headache actually for Chile on how to develop this. So this is the situation right now, and we'll see how it develops. I know that we need to close.
Yeah, we need to probably close out, but thank you so much for that. We've gone through the questions, so that's a good thing. And I can't help thinking, listening to you and also listening to Chris. I mean, in the end, it seems like you're seeing Latin American politics, despite these sort of populist efforts, as fundamentally at a kind of basic level relatively stable. At least in terms of political forces, the big force for instability being the inequality that you were talking about at the beginning of your remarks. So, Juan, Cruz, thank you so much, as always. An educational experience listening to you. But I'm sorry, go ahead.
Just a comment. Yeah, just a comment. I know that Carlos Reguna made a comment there, and then saying, I'm not saying that the massive agriculture and cattle raising in Argentina is not environmentally friendly, but I'm saying that it gets in some tensions with some of the green agenda that it's going around there. Of course, the industry outside
Argentina as well. But yeah,
exactly. I mean, of course, the local producers are defending that, but of course, there are tensions with that green agenda in that sense.